It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Arthur Valerius laughed as he flicked scotch onto Vada Valerius's silk sleeve in front of the entire board. The amber liquid bloomed like a bruise against the cream-colored fabric, a deliberate stain on a bespoke garment that cost more than the monthly salary of his head of security. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look at her face. Instead, he turned back to the circle of investors, his gold-plated Rolex catching the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers. "My daughter has a talent for being invisible," he said, his voice booming with the practiced, hollow charm of a man who owned the room only because he shouted the loudest. "It's a shame she didn't inherit my flair for the spotlight, but someone has to take the minutes, right?" The investors chuckled, a dry, sycophantic sound that grated against the elegant strains of the string quartet playing in the corner. Vada felt the cold dampness of the alcohol seeping through the silk to her skin. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for a napkin to scrub at the insult. She simply stood there, a silent shadow in the center of the gilded ballroom, her expression as unreadable as a closed ledger. Beside Arthur, Julian Valerius smirked, adjusting his designer tie with a flourish. He looked every bit the heir apparent, draped in loud luxury that screamed for the attention he hadn't earned. He had spent the last 3 months innovating the syndicate's data protocols, which really meant he had spent 3 months copying Vada's encrypted architecture and slapping his own name on the digital files. "Don't be so hard on her, Dad," Julian said, his tone dripping with a fake, oily sympathy. "Vada knows her place. She's the backbone of the back office. Some people are just born to stay behind the curtain." Evelyn Valerius stood a few feet away, her eyes fixed on her own reflection in a champagne flute. She adjusted her diamond necklace, her silence a cold endorsement of the humiliation. She had long ago traded her daughter's protection for a permanent seat at the high table of social relevance. To her, Vada was a tool, useful for maintaining the lifestyle, but ultimately socially disposable. Vada's hand drifted to the small, unbranded clutch at her side. Inside lay an encrypted mobile device that hummed with a single, silent vibration. It was a signal from Cashin. The perimeter was secure. The data migration was complete. The Paper King was standing on a foundation of digital sand, and he didn't even feel the tide coming in. "The appetizers are running low, Vada," Arthur snapped, not bothering to turn around as he signaled a waiter for another drink. "Go find the catering manager. Make yourself useful for once instead of standing there like a statue." "Of course, Father," she replied. Her voice was a low, melodic contrast to his jagged bark. It carried the terrifying weight of a mountain, though no one in the room was quiet enough to hear the warning. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the marble floor. The smell of Arthur's peaty, expensive scotch followed her, a cloying reminder of the man's unearned entitlement. She passed through the heavy oak doors of the ballroom and into the dimly lit hallway, where the air was cooler, smelling of old wood and the metallic tang of high-end security systems. Cashin was waiting in the shadows near the library, his silhouette sharp and imposing. He didn't speak as she approached. He simply handed her a single, flesh-colored earbud. "The judge is in position," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Dominic Thorne has the original deeds, the ones your father thought he burned 10 years ago to hide the debt." Vada placed the earbud in her ear. She felt a flicker of crystalline satisfaction. For 20 years, she had been the architect of the Valerius Empire, the ghost in the machine who turned Arthur's failures into fortunes. She had watched him take the credit, watched him belittle her, and watched him hand her hard-won victories to a brother who couldn't code a basic firewall. She looked down at the stain on her sleeve. It was a mark of his arrogance, a physical manifestation of the debt he was about to pay in full. "Is the board meeting still set for Thursday?" she asked. 10 a.m., Cashin confirmed. "Arthur thinks it's a coronation for Julian. He's already invited the press for the passing of the torch ceremony. He wants the world to see him hand the keys to his son." Vada leaned against the mahogany paneling, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. She thought of the witnesses in the ballroom, The men and women who had laughed at her expense, the mother who had looked away, and the father who thought a gold watch made him a king. "Let him have his ceremony," Vada said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I want the room full when the lights go out." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, silver flash drive. It looked like a piece of jewelry, elegant and unassuming. It contained the digital kill switch for every offshore account Arthur Valerius owned. By the time the sun rose on Thursday, the paper king wouldn't have enough credit to buy the scotch he liked to throw. "Vada?" Cashin asked, sensing the shift in her energy. She looked toward the closed ballroom doors, where the muffled sound of Arthur's laughter still echoed. "He told me to make myself useful," she said softly. "I think it's time I took his advice." She began to walk toward the exit, her pace unhurried and lethal. Behind her, the party continued, a celebration of a legacy that was already a ghost. Arthur was still at the center of the room, toast after toast ringing out in his honor. He had no idea that the daughter he had just dismissed was the only thing keeping the ceiling from collapsing on his head. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she took a deep breath. The countdown had begun. 48 hours until the Valerius name belonged to her, and her alone. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to an unsaved number. "Begin the audit." The next morning, the air in the Valerius penthouse tasted of stale cigar smoke and the metallic tang of impending ruin. Vada Valerius stood in the center of her father's mahogany-lined study, her feet planted firmly on the Persian rug. She wore a blouse of charcoal silk, bespoke and unbranded, the fabric moving like liquid against her skin. It was a silent contrast to the man sitting behind the desk. Arthur Valerius leaned back, the sunlight catching the gaudy, gold-plated face of his Rolex. He didn't look up from the ledger he was pretending to understand. He simply tapped a heavy gold fountain pen against the wood, a rhythmic, dismissive sound that echoed the heartbeat of a dying empire. "You're late," he said, his voice gravelly with the remnants of last night's scotch. "I told you to be here at 8. There are things to be done before the gala, and I won't have you idling while Julian is out securing our future." "I was reviewing the overnight reports," she replied, her voice a calm, level stream. "The credit lines are tightening, Father. We should discuss the restructuring." He finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and narrow. "Restructuring? You've spent too much time listening to accountants." "We are the Valerius family. We don't restructure, we expand." He slid a thick blue folder across the desk. It hit her hand with a dull thud. "Sign these. Julian needs the intellectual property rights for the Neuralink project transferred to his shell company by noon. It's for tax purposes." Vada looked down at the folder. She didn't need to open it to know what it contained. It was the patent for the core algorithm she had spent 3 years developing in secret, the very foundation of her private intelligence syndicate. Julian hadn't just stolen her notes, he was trying to steal the soul of her work. The door clicked open, and Julian Valerius sauntered in, smelling of expensive cologne and unearned victory. He didn't look at his sister. He went straight to the sideboard and poured himself a coffee. "Is it done yet? The investors are waiting at the club, and I promised them the full rights package before lunch." "Vada was just about to sign," Arthur said, his tone sharpening. "Weren't you?" Evelyn Valerius appeared in the doorway, her silk wrap trailing behind her like a shroud. She glanced at her daughter, her expression one of practiced indifference. "Don't be difficult, Vada. Your brother needs this to solidify the family's standing. It's high time you showed some loyalty instead of hoarding those little projects of yours." The rage was a cold, sharp blade in Vada's chest, but she didn't let it reach her eyes. She felt the weight of the phone in her pocket, the encrypted link to Cashin already active. She knew something they didn't. She knew that the investors Julian was meeting were actually frontmen for her own syndicate. She knew that the debt Arthur was trying to refinance had been bought up 48 hours ago by a holding company called Sovereign. She was the Sovereign. "I see," she said softly. She picked up the gold pen. The metal was cold. She scrawled a signature on the top page, not her legal name, but a stylized mark that looked identical to it, yet lacked the legal weight of a sworn witness. "There, I've given Julian exactly what he deserves. Julian snatched the folder, a smirk spreading across his face. Finally, try to look presentable for the gala in 48 hours, Vada. I've invited the press. It's going to be the biggest night in this family's history. I'm sure it will be, she said. She turned and walked out of the study, her heels silent on the marble floor. She didn't stop until she reached the elevator. As the doors slid shut, she pulled out her phone. Cashin was already on the line. The signature is delivered, she said, her voice dropping into the low, terrifying register of the woman who ran the underground. He thinks he has the keys to the kingdom. Is Dominic Thorne ready? The judge has the original deeds and the evidence of Julian's fraud, Cashin replied, his voice a steady anchor. He's waiting for your signal at the gala. Good. She watched the floor numbers descend. Arthur thinks he's spending the weekend celebrating his legacy. Let him buy the most expensive champagne in the cellar. I want him to have a very clear memory of the taste before I take the vineyard from him. She stepped out into the lobby, the cool morning air hitting her face. 48 hours. The countdown was no longer a threat, it was a promise. She looked up at the towering Valerius sign atop the building, the gold letters gleaming in the sun. By the time the sun set on Saturday, those letters would be on the sidewalk, and the only name left standing would be hers. Cashin, she said, stepping into the waiting black sedan. Tell the audit team to move to phase 2. I want every bank account frozen the moment the first toast is poured. 2 days had passed since Vada Valerius had stood in the shadow of her father's empire, and the air in the city had grown thick with the static of an approaching storm. She stood now in the dim, mahogany-scented study of a secluded estate on the outskirts of the city. The rooms smelled of ancient parchment and floor wax, a sanctuary of old-world law that felt 1,000 miles away from the glass and steel of the Valerius headquarters. Dominic Thorne sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single, massive oak. He was a man whose face was a map of decades spent in the pursuit of justice, and as he slid a heavy, leather-bound portfolio toward her, his expression was solemn. The original deeds are in there, Vada, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Along with the forensic audit of the intellectual property transfer. Julian was sloppy. He thought that because he had his father's blessing, he didn't need to cover his tracks. He didn't just steal your designs, he left a digital signature on the theft. Vada touched the cool, pebbled surface of the leather. Inside this folder was the kinetic energy of a landslide. It was the physical proof that her brother was a fraud and her father was a conspirator. She felt the quiet, terrifying weight of the evidence, a secret power that hummed beneath her fingertips. And the judge's seal? She asked. Notarized and verified, Dominic replied. The moment you present these at the gala, the legal standing of the Valerius group dissolves. They aren't just facing a lawsuit, they're facing a total asset seizure. Her phone buzzed on the desk, the caller ID flashing a name that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. Arthur Valerius. She answered, her face a mask of practiced indifference. Yes, father. Where the hell are you? Arthur's voice boomed through the line, loud and aggressive, the sound of a man who believed the world existed only to serve his whims. The caterers for the Vineyard Gala are complaining about the security protocols, and your mother says you haven't approved the floral arrangements. I don't pay you to hide in the corners of the city, Vada. Get back here and do your job. I'm finalizing the guest list, Arthur, she said, her voice like a frozen lake. I want to ensure everyone who matters is in the room when the first toast is poured. The guest list is Julian's concern now, he snapped. He's the face of the Sovereign Project. You're just the logistics coordinator. Try to remember your place. And for heaven's sake, buy a dress that doesn't look like it came from a clearance rack. You're a Valerius even if you don't act like one. Don't embarrass us by looking like the help. Vada's grip tightened on the edge of the desk, her nails digging into the wood. The rage was a familiar heat, but she channeled it into a cold, sharp focus. I'll make sure I'm dressed appropriately for the occasion, Father. You won't recognize me. She hung up before he could respond. Across the desk, Dominic Thorne watched her with a knowing look. He had seen many empires fall, and he knew the look of the person holding the torch. An hour later, Vada arrived at the Valerius estate for the final pre-gala briefing. The foyer was a chaotic symphony of opulence. Evelyn Valerius stood in the center of the room, draped in emerald silk that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers. She was directing a team of decorators with the casual cruelty of a queen. "No, the lilies go in the east wing," Evelyn said, not even glancing at Vada as she walked in. "And Vada, do be a dear and check the wine cellar. Julian says the vintage Arthur selected isn't prestigious enough for the investors. He wants the 1945 reserve brought up." Julian Valerius stepped out from the dining hall, flaunting a gold-plated watch that caught the afternoon light, sending a blinding glint across the room. He looked at Vada with a smirk that made her skin crawl, the look of a thief who believed he had gotten away with the perfect crime. "Don't strain yourself, Vada," Julian said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "I know how hard it must be for you, watching the family reach new heights on the back of my designs. But don't worry, I've made sure there's a small mention of your administrative support in the closing remarks of my speech." He walked closer, the scent of his cloying, expensive cologne filling the space between them. He leaned in, his voice a low hiss. "I saw the seating chart you drafted. I had it changed. You're at table 24 near the kitchens. It's better if you stay out of the sightlines of the major donors. We wouldn't want your drab energy ruining the mood." The arrogance was a physical weight in the room. Julian truly believed he had won. He believed the sister he had stepped on was too broken to fight back. Vada didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, her eyes tracing the lines of his expensive suit, seeing the hollow man underneath. "Table 24, she repeated, her voice remarkably calm. "I'll remember that, Julian, but I think you'll find that by the end of the night, everyone will be looking exactly where I want them to." "Is that a threat?" Julian laughed, a sharp, entitled sound that echoed off the marble floors. "What are you going to do? Spill wine on my shoes? Grow up, Vada, you're a footnote in this family's history. Tomorrow night I become the legend." He turned on his heel and walked away, his laughter trailing behind him like a foul odor. Vada turned and walked toward the exit, where Cashin was waiting by the black sedan. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, jagged shadows across the manicured lawn. "Is everything ready?" she asked as she stepped into the car. "The audit team has the codes," Cashin said, his voice a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. "The moment the presentation begins tomorrow, the bank freeze will trigger. Arthur and Julian will be standing on a stage in front of the most powerful people in the country, and they won't have enough liquid credit to buy a cup of coffee." Vada looked out the window at the Valerius crest embossed on the iron gates. 24 hours. The countdown was no longer a sequence of numbers. It was a heartbeat. She felt the leather portfolio against her side, the evidence that would turn their world to ash. "Good," she said, her voice a whisper of lethal intent. "Let them enjoy their last night of royalty. Tomorrow, the sovereign takes her throne." The following afternoon, the air at the Valerius estate was thick with the cloying scent of white lilies and the metallic tang of an approaching storm. Vada Valerius stood on the marble terrace, her fingers trailing over the cold stone railing. Below, a small army of caterers and decorators swarmed the lawn, erecting the massive white pavilion where the Valerius group would celebrate its 30th anniversary tomorrow. She wore a shift of charcoal silk, unbranded and devoid of logos, the fabric so fine it felt like a second skin. It was a sharp contrast to Arthur Valerius, who marched toward her with the heavy, rhythmic thud of handmade Italian leather loafers. He paused to check his reflection in the glass doors, adjusting his silk tie and buffing a smudge off his gold-plated watch. "Vada, there you are," he barked, not looking at her but at the progress on the lawn. "Julian says he's having trouble accessing the secondary encryption on the architecture servers. Hand over your master key by tonight. I won't have him fumbling on stage during the demonstration tomorrow." She turned slowly, her expression a mask of glacial calm. "The encryption is there for a reason, Father. It protects the integrity of the data." If Julian hasn't mastered the system I built, perhaps he shouldn't be the one presenting it. Arthur finally looked at her, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, entitled venom. He stepped into her personal space, the smell of expensive bourbon and tobacco rolling off him in waves. You forget your place. You are a ghost in this company, a shadow I allowed to linger because you were useful. Tomorrow, Julian becomes the face of the legacy. You will give him the key, or I will have security escort you from this house before the first guest arrives. Do you understand? I understand perfectly, she replied, her voice a low, steady hum. She reached into her small clutch, her fingers brushing the edge of the encrypted drive cache had finalized an hour ago. But I should warn you, Arthur. The foundation of this legacy is far more fragile than you realize. If you force the lock, the whole structure might come down. He let out a sharp, barking laugh that carried across the terrace, causing a nearby florist to flinch. You always were melodramatic. What could you possibly do? You have no allies, no leverage, and certainly no money that I didn't give you. Tomorrow, the world sees Julian as the genius, and you go back to the corner I carved out for you. He turned on his heel, the gold on his wrist catching the sun with a blinding, arrogant flash. Vada watched him go, her heart rate steady, her pulse a rhythmic countdown. Behind her, the glass door slid open. Evelyn Valerius stepped out, draped in a cream pashmina that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She didn't look at her daughter. She looked at the flower arrangements. Try to wear something with more color tomorrow, Vada, her mother murmured, her voice airy and dismissive. You look so drab in that gray. It's Julian's big night. The least you can do is look like you belong in this family. I'll be sure to wear something memorable, Mother, Vada said. A few yards away, near the edge of the garden, Dominic Thorne stood in the shade of a willow tree. The retired judge was ostensibly there to consult on the Gala's legal permits, but his gaze remained fixed on Vada. He saw the way she stood, not like a dismissed daughter, but like a general surveying a battlefield. He caught her eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The smoking gun was loaded. As the sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the estate, Cashin appeared at the base of the terrace steps. He didn't speak, but the subtle vibration of Vada's phone in her pocket told her everything. The audit was live. The bank freeze was a coiled spring, waiting for the first transaction of the Gala to trigger a total systemic collapse. Vada looked out over the sprawling lawn, the white pavilion looking like a giant shroud in the twilight. She felt a strange, cold sense of peace. The warning had been given. The arrogance had been confirmed. 20 hours, she whispered to the rising wind. She turned and walked into the house, leaving the lilies and the lies behind. Tomorrow, the sovereign would not just take her throne. She would burn the old one to the ground while the world watched the flames. By 7 o'clock, the Valerius estate had been transformed into a gilded theater of curated deception. Amber floodlights bathed the limestone facade, casting long, predatory shadows across the manicured gardens, where the elite of the intelligence and tech worlds now mingled. Vada stood on the upper mezzanine, the cool, heavy slide of her bespoke, unbranded silk gown feeling like armor against her skin. She didn't need a label to announce her worth. The fabric moved like liquid moonlight, a silent testament to the quiet, terrifying weight of the authority she carried. Below her, the Gala was a sea of forced smiles and expensive perfumes, but to her eyes, it was a battlefield where the lines had already been drawn. Arthur Valerius was already at the center of the fray, holding court near the fountain. He was a man composed of loud, aggressive luxury, his gold-plated watch catching the glare of the spotlights every time he gestured with a glass of vintage scotch. His laughter boomed over the refined murmur of the crowd, the sound of a man who believed he had finally bought the world's silence. He looked up, spotting her, and his expression curdled into a mask of paternal disappointment. "There she is," he announced, his voice carrying to the surrounding circle of investors. "The daughter who prefers the shadows to the throne." He beckoned her down with a sharp, commanding flick of his wrist. "Come, Vada, don't lurk up there like a gargoyle, you're depressing the guests." The circle of enablers chuckled, a sycophantic ripple that made the air feel thin. Vada descended the stone stairs with a measured grace that drew more eyes than Arthur's booming voice ever could. She felt the gaze of Dominic Thorne from across the terrace. The retired judge stood by a marble pillar, his glass raised in a nearly imperceptible salute. He was the witness she needed, the man whose presence turned this party into a courtroom. "I'm merely observing the foundation, Father," she said, her voice a calm, low-frequency hum that cut through his bluster. "It's important to know exactly what's supporting us before the weight increases." Arthur's eyes narrowed, the gold of his watch glinting as he gripped his glass tighter. "Always the philosopher. It's a shame you didn't inherit Julian's mind for practicalities. He's inside right now, closing the deal of the century with the Singapore contingent, using that new encryption architecture he developed." The mention of the stolen intellectual property was a deliberate jab, a rage-inducing reminder of the betrayal that had sparked this war. Arthur leaned in, the scent of expensive tobacco and arrogance rolling off him in waves. "Try to smile, Vada, or at least try to look like you belong in a house this expensive. I'd hate for people to think you're just the help in a better dress." She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached out and straightened his lapel, her fingers steady. "I belong exactly where I am, Arthur. I think you'll find that by the end of the night, everyone will agree on who owns what." He scoffed, turning back to his guests and dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Vada moved through the crowd, a ghost in the machine. She found Vada Valerius near the buffet, draped in diamonds that looked like ice against her throat. Her mother looked at her with a fleeting, haunted sort of recognition before masking it with a practiced social smile. "You should have worn the rubies I sent to your room," Evelyn whispered, her voice tight. "They would have made you look significant." "I don't need stones to be significant, Mother," she replied, her gaze sweeping the room. "I prefer to let the facts speak for themselves." A hand touched her elbow. She didn't need to turn to know it was Cashin. He leaned in, appearing to offer her a tray of hors d'oeuvres, but his voice was a razor-thin report. "The audit has hit the primary servers. The bank freeze is active. Julian is trying to authorize the first transfer for the Singapore deal right now. He's getting a system error message." Vada took a small, delicate pastry from the tray, her eyes fixed on the grand ballroom doors. "And the reaction?" "He's panicking," Cashin murmured. "He thinks it's a technical glitch. He's calling Arthur over. The judge is positioned by the podium. Everything is ready." Vada felt a surge of cold, crystalline focus. This was the wait-for-it moment, the heartbeat before the avalanche. She looked across the lawn and saw Julian Valerius emerge from the house, his face flushed a frantic shade of red that clashed with his designer tuxedo. He was sweating, his eyes darting through the crowd until they landed on his father. He hurried toward Arthur, whispering urgently into his ear. Arthur's boisterous demeanor didn't collapse immediately. It eroded. He shook his head, gesturing toward the house, his gold watch flashing as he pointed toward the offices. He clearly thought this was a minor hurdle, a small stone in the path of his destiny. He didn't realize the path had ended a mile back. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur's voice suddenly rang out, amplified by the house speakers. He stepped toward the small podium at the edge of the terrace, Julian hovering behind him like a nervous shadow. "If I could have your attention, we are about to witness a historic moment for the Valerius group." The crowd quieted, the clink of crystal against silver the only sound in the humid night air. Dominic Thorne moved closer to the front, his face a granite mask of anticipation. Vada stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her, the silent sovereign watching the paper king prepare his own gallows. Arthur adjusted the microphone, his chest puffed out, the image of a man in total control. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate wealth. We celebrate legacy. Julian, if you would do the honors of initiating the global launch." Julian stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the tablet resting on the podium. He looked at the screen, his brow furrowing. He tapped it once, twice. Then he looked at his father, his voice cracking as it caught the microphone. "Father, the accounts, they're gone, all of them. There's a message on the screen." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the estate. Arthur snatched the tablet from his son's hand, his face contorting as he read the glowing text. Vada felt the weight of the moment, the satisfaction of the trap finally snapping shut. She began to walk forward, the crowd parting for her as if she were the blade of a scythe. "Is there a problem, Arthur?" she asked, her voice carrying effortlessly across the silent terrace. He looked up, his eyes wild, his arrogance finally curdling into the first sharp edge of terror. He looked at the tablet, then at her, then at the rows of witnesses who were now leaning in, sensing the blood in the water. "What have you done?" he hissed, the microphone catching the venom in his breath. Vada reached the base of the podium and looked up at him, her expression one of terrifying, unshakable peace. "I haven't done anything that wasn't already earned. I'm just here to make sure the audit is thorough." She turned to the crowd, her gaze landing on Judge Thorne. The countdown had hit 0. The gala was no longer a celebration. It was an execution, and the first witness was already stepping forward. Arthur Valerius stood frozen behind the mahogany podium, his fingers white-knuckled as they gripped the edges of the wood. The silence on the terrace was absolute, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the massive LED screens that flanked the stage. He tried to speak, but the only sound that escaped his throat was a dry, clicking rasp. He looked down at the tablet Vada had placed before him, and for a moment, the guests saw the exact second his reality fractured. Vada Valerius didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She stood 3 steps below him, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight, draped in unbranded charcoal silk that seemed to absorb the very light around her. She looked like a shadow that had finally decided to take form. "The audit is already live, Arthur," she said, her voice a calm, crystalline blade that cut through the humid night air. "Every guest here just received a push notification. It's not just the company's books, it's the offshore accounts. The ones you thought were ghost-signed, the ones you used to siphon the syndicate's liquid assets to pay for this very gala." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Phones began to chime in a discordant symphony of pings and vibrations. At the front table, Evelyn Valerius dropped her crystal flute. The sound of shattering glass punctuated the silence like a gunshot. She stared at the screen of her phone, her face draining of color until her heavy makeup looked like a mask on a corpse. Beside her, Julian Valerius was frantically scrolling, his youthful arrogance replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation as he realized the intellectual property he had developed was listed in the audit as a direct theft from a shell company owned by Vada. Arthur's reaction was visceral. The skin of his face didn't just pale, it turned a sickly, translucent gray, like old parchment left in the rain. His jaw unhinged, his lower lip beginning a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that he couldn't suppress. The arrogance that usually sat like a granite mask on his features shattered, leaving behind a hollow-eyed ghost of the man who had walked onto the stage. He looked smaller, his frame appearing to shrink inside his expensive suit, while his eyes darted left and right, searching for an exit that didn't exist. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, carving a path through his bronzer, making him look like a melting waxwork of a king. "This is a fabrication," Arthur finally screamed, but the microphone betrayed him, projecting his cracking, high-pitched terror to every corner of the estate. "Is it?" Dominic Thorne stepped forward from the shadows of the stone pillars. The retired judge moved with a slow, deliberate gravity that commanded the room's attention. He held a physical leather-bound folder, but his eyes were fixed on Arthur with the cold judgment of a man who had seen 1,000 liars crumble. "I've spent the last 6 months verifying these chains of custody, Arthur," Dominic said, his voice echoing with the weight of undisputed authority. "The signatures aren't forged. They're yours. And the person you were stealing from wasn't a faceless entity. It was the sovereign." The guests shifted, a physical distancing occurring in real time. The circle of elite friends who had spent the evening basking in Arthur's glow suddenly pulled back, leaving him isolated on the stage. The smell of expensive lilies and heavy perfume seemed to sour in the air, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the screens. Vada stepped onto the first stair of the podium, looking up at the man who had spent a lifetime trying to bury her. "You called me a guest in this house, Arthur. You told me I didn't belong at this table." She paused, her expression one of terrifying, unshakable peace. "You were right. I don't belong at your table because I own the house. I own the land. And as of 4 minutes ago, I own the debt you used to buy that watch on your wrist." She turned to Cashin, who stood at the edge of the stage, his hand resting invisibly near his jacket. He gave a single, sharp nod. The execution was complete. "Security will escort you to the gate," Vada said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow reached every ear. "Don't bother going back inside. The locks were changed while you were giving your speech." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch him beg or to see the security team step onto the stage. Vada turned her back on the podium and walked toward the stone stairs, her silk gown whispering against the marble. Dominic, Thorne, and Cashin fell in behind her, a phalanx of silent, absolute power. As she reached the edge of the terrace, she didn't look back at the ruin of her family. She looked toward the horizon, where the first hint of a new dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky. Behind her, the Paper King finally fell to his knees, but the sovereign was already gone. The terrace remained a stage of frozen actors, the only sound the rhythmic, heavy thud of security boots on the gravel below. Arthur Valerius stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving as he stared at the blank screen that had just stripped him of his soul. He looked at the guests, the titans of industry he had spent decades courting, and saw only the backs of heads as they turned away, shielding themselves from the stench of his sudden, absolute failure. The air smelled of ozone, and the cloying, funereal scent of the white lilies lining the balustrade. "This is a fabrication," Arthur's voice cracked, the sound high and thin, stripped of its usual baritone authority. He lunged toward the podium, but Cashin stepped forward, a silent, immovable wall of dark wool and muscle. Arthur recoiled, his gold-plated watch catching the moonlight with a flash that seemed garish and cheap. "Vada, stop this madness. You're my daughter. You can't seize personal assets based on a disgruntled employee's lies." Vada Valerius didn't stop. She didn't even turn around. She stood at the edge of the marble stairs, her back a straight, uncompromising line of bespoke silk. It was Dominic Thorne who stepped into the light, holding a thick, leather-bound folder with the weight of a tombstone. "They aren't personal assets anymore, Arthur," the retired judge said, his voice echoing with the finality of a gavel. "You leveraged the Valerius estate, the holdings, and even this very house to cover the $300 million shortfall from Julian's failed encryption launch. You signed the debt over to a private equity firm called Sovereign Holdings." Dominic paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Vada is the sole director of Sovereign. She bought your debt at dawn. She isn't just your daughter anymore, she's your primary creditor." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sharp, frantic clicking of Julian Valerius's phone as he desperately tried to access his offshore accounts. "It's locked," the younger brother whispered, his face ashen. "Everything, the trust, the venture capital, it's all gone." Arthur's features didn't just drop, they seemed to liquefy. The aggressive, ruddy color that usually defined his cheeks drained away, leaving behind a sallow, grayish pallor that made him look 20 years older in a single heartbeat. His lower lip developed a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor, and his eyes, once sharp with predatory arrogance, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the exits like a trapped animal. Sweat broke out in a greasy sheen across his forehead, matting his carefully styled hair as his shoulders slumped, the invisible scaffolding of his ego finally snapping under the weight of the truth. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe, his mouth hanging open in a silent, hollow O. Evelyn Valerius stepped forward then, her silk gown rustling like a dead leaf. She reached out a hand toward Vada, her expression a practiced mask of maternal concern that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Vada, darling, let's be reasonable. Think of the family name. Think of the scandal. We can go inside, pour a drink, and settle this like the Valerius family always has." Vada finally turned. The look she gave her mother was devoid of anger, which made it far more terrifying. It was the look a scientist gives a specimen under a microscope. The Valerius family settled things with lies and theft, Evelyn. I'm settling things with receipts. She glanced at the security team. Escort them to the gate. They are permitted to take the clothes they are wearing and nothing else. The jewelry, the watches, the phones, they are all property of the firm now. You can't do this, Julian screamed, his voice breaking into a sob. I have a life, I have plans. Your plans were built on my work, Julian, Vada said, her voice a calm, freezing wind. And your life was a loan I've decided to call in. She watched as the board members, men who had laughed at Arthur's jokes and ignored Vada's brilliance for years, began to move. They didn't go to Arthur. They moved toward her, their faces twisting into masks of sudden, sycophantic respect. One by one, they offered their hands, their apologies, their loyalty. Vada ignored them all, her gaze fixed on the man who had spent a lifetime trying to bury her. Arthur was being led away, his feet dragging on the marble he had once claimed to own. He looked back once, his eyes meeting hers. There was no fire left in them, only the hollow, echoing realization that the daughter he had treated as a tool had become the architect of his extinction. Vada felt the cool weight of the evening air against her skin, the tension that had lived in her marrow for a decade finally beginning to dissolve. She didn't feel the euphoria she had expected. She felt only a profound, quiet clarity. The paper king was gone, his empire folded into the shadows where she had always reigned. The cars are waiting, Cashin whispered, stepping to her side. Vada nodded, taking one last look at the darkened mansion behind her. Let's go, Cashin. There's nothing left here but ghosts and bad debt. She walked down the stairs, her heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm against the stone. Behind her, the gates of the Valerius estate swung shut with a heavy, metallic clang, locking the past away in the dark. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The world was waiting, and for the first time in her life, she owned every inch of the path ahead. 6 months had passed since the gates of the Valerius estate slammed shut for the final time. In the high-altitude silence of her new headquarters, Vada Valerius watched the city pulse below like a cooling ember. The office was a masterclass in understated power, obsidian floors, walls of reinforced glass, and a desk carved from a single block of petrified wood. There were no logos here, no gold-plated trophies, and no loud displays of wealth. Only the hum of servers, and the scent of expensive white tea remained. Cashin stepped into the room, his footsteps silent on the stone. He didn't need to announce himself. He placed a thin, recycled paper folder on the desk. The final liquidations are complete, he said, his voice a steady anchor in the quiet. The Paper King's empire has been officially dissolved. Every asset, every patent, and every hidden offshore account now flows through your primary trust. Vada didn't look at the folder immediately. She adjusted the cuff of her bespoke charcoal silk blouse, feeling the weight of the silence. And the man himself. Arthur Valerius was spotted yesterday morning in a district he used to call a slum, Cashin replied, tapping a tablet to reveal a grainy surveillance still. Vada leaned in. The image showed a man who looked 20 years older than the patriarch she remembered. Arthur was standing outside a cramped, one-bedroom rental in a graying suburb. The tailored Italian suits were gone, replaced by a fraying polyester jacket. His hands, once heavy with rings, were shoved deep into his pockets as he stared at a discarded newspaper on the sidewalk. There was no gold-plated watch on his wrist, only a pale circle of skin where his pride used to sit. He had tried to sell the fake Rolex to a pawn shop 3 weeks ago, only to be laughed out of the store when the jeweler confirmed it was a lead-filled knockoff. He's counting coins for the bus, Vada, Cashin added. The board members he used to drink 1945 Romanée Conti with won't even take his calls. To the world, he's a ghost. To the bank, he's a liability. Vada felt a cold, sharp prick of satisfaction, but it didn't burn. It was a clinical sort of justice. She thought of the nights she had spent in the basement of the estate, building the algorithms that Arthur had claimed as his own. She thought of the wine he had poured over her head during that final board meeting, mocking her for being nothing more than a servant with a last name. Now Julian Valerius was faring no better. Her brother had been blacklisted from every tech incubator from San Francisco to Shenzhen. He was currently working under a pseudonym as a night shift data entry clerk for a logistics firm, his dreams of being a visionary buried under a mountain of spreadsheets and minimum wage reality. "And Evelyn?" Vada asked. "Your mother is living in a small cottage in the countryside," Cashin said. "She still sends the letters, one every Tuesday." Vada glanced at the corner of her desk, where a stack of unopened envelopes sat. She knew what they contained: apologies that tasted like copper, pleas for a family reunion, and subtle requests for a monthly allowance to maintain her dignity. Evelyn Valerius had spent her life choosing social standing over her daughter's safety, and now that the standing was gone, she was searching for a new host. "Keep them," Vada said softly, "but don't open them." She stood and walked to the window. The victory was total. The paper king was a pauper, the traitor was a drone, and the enabler was an outcast. She had dismantled their world with the same surgical precision she used to build her intelligence network. She was the sovereign now, the undisputed head of a global syndicate that operated in the cracks of the world. Yet, as she looked at her reflection in the glass, she saw the cost. Her eyes were harder, the light of her younger self replaced by a predatory clarity. She had won the war, but she had burned the bridge back to anything resembling a normal life. She was surrounded by loyalty she had bought and respect she had commanded through fear, but the warmth of a home was a ghost she had traded for the throne. Dominic Thorne had called her the day before, his voice crackling with the weariness of a man who had seen too much. "You got what you wanted, Vada," he had said. "Just make sure you like the view from the top. It gets thin up there." She turned away from the window and sat back down at the obsidian desk. The room was beautiful, sterile, and perfectly quiet. She picked up a fountain pen, the cold metal grounding her. "Cashin," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Prepare the files for the Thorne acquisition. We have work to do." She didn't look back at the photos of the broken man in the polyester jacket. The past was a bad debt, and she had finally settled the account. She was the sovereign, and while the throne was cold, it was hers, every inch of it.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.